I never thought the day would come when my own son would look me in the eyes and erase my entire life with a single sentence. "Mom, you didn't sacrifice anything for me." Ethan said it calmly, almost casually, as if he were stating a fact everyone already knew. His girlfriend, Lauren, stood beside him, arms crossed, watching me like I was some kind of stranger trying to rewrite history. Then he added, "I've seen the records. You never paid for my tuition. Not once." In that moment, my heart didn't just break. It questioned everything. If I didn't pay for his life, then who did? Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. In that moment, my heart didn't just break. It questioned everything. If I didn't pay for his life, then who did? Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been misunderstood by someone you gave everything to? If this story already hits close to home, take a second to like this video, and if you believe truth always finds a way out, subscribe and stay with me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one, because tonight I'm finally telling my side of the story. I didn't answer Ethan that night. I couldn't. When someone you love rewrites your entire life as if it never happened, words don't come easily. They sit somewhere deep in your chest, tangled with pain, disbelief, and a kind of quiet grief you don't even recognize at first. But as I stood there staring at my son, my boy, the one I raised with everything I had, I felt something rise inside me. Not anger, not yet. Memory. Because the truth, the real truth, doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to see it. And if Ethan believed my sacrifices were imaginary, then it meant he had never really seen them to begin with. So let me tell you what those imaginary sacrifices looked like. I was 38 years old when David walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He didn't even look back. He just picked up his suitcase, said, "I can't do this anymore," and left me standing in the kitchen with a sink full of dishes and a 10-year-old boy doing homework at the table. Ethan looked up and asked, "Where's Dad going?" And I lied. I said, "He just needs some time." I didn't know then that some time would turn into forever. The first night after David left, I sat at the edge of my bed and looked at the numbers on a piece of paper. Rent, utilities, groceries, school supplies, insurance. And then I looked at my paycheck. It didn't add up. Not even close. I was already working as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, but it wasn't enough. Not for a growing boy. Not for a future I refused to let him lose. So I did what mothers do. I figured it out. I picked up night shifts, not occasionally, consistently. I would leave the house at 6 p.m., kiss Ethan goodnight while he pretended not to be scared, and drive to the hospital where I would spend 12 hours on my feet. By the time I got home, the sun would be rising. Some mornings, I didn't even make it to bed. I'd sit in the car for a few minutes just staring at the steering wheel, trying to gather enough strength to go inside and be a mother again. Because Ethan would be awake soon. And he needed breakfast. He needed help with homework. He needed someone who looked like she wasn't falling apart. So I learned how to hide it. I learned how to smile when I was exhausted. How to laugh when I was worried. How to say everything's fine when nothing about our situation was fine. But nursing alone wasn't enough. So I took a second job. There was a small diner a few blocks away called Rosie's. Nothing fancy, just coffee, pancakes, and regulars who came in every morning like clockwork. I worked there on weekends, sometimes Friday nights too if someone called in sick. I'd tie my hair back, put on that faded apron, and carry plates with a smile that wasn't entirely fake. Because tips mattered. Every dollar mattered. I remember one night in particular. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that makes the streets look like mirrors. Business was slow, and I was wiping down the counter when Ethan called. He must have been 12 then. "Mom," he said, "are you coming home soon?" I looked at the clock. 2 more hours left in my shift. "Soon, sweetheart," I said. "Did you eat dinner?" "Yeah," he said. I miss you." I had to turn away so the other waitress wouldn't see my face. "I miss you too," I whispered. But I stayed. Because missing him didn't pay the bills, and loving him meant making sure he never felt the weight of what we were going through. As he got older, the expenses grew. Middle school turned into high school, and suddenly there were things like sports fees, school trips, SAT prep classes. I didn't say no. I couldn't, because every time I looked at Ethan, I saw potential. I saw a future bigger than the one I had been given. So I made choices. I sold my car once, not because I wanted to, but because tuition for his private high school was due and I was short. I remember standing in the driveway watching the buyer drive it away, thinking, that was my last bit of comfort. After that, I took the bus. Rain or shine, day or night. 2 transfers to get to the hospital. 1 more to get to the diner. Sometimes I'd fall asleep sitting up my head against the window, praying I wouldn't miss my stop. But when I walked through the door and saw Ethan at the table, books spread out working towards something better, it was worth it. Every single time. There were nights when I ate cereal for dinner because I needed to save money for his textbooks. There were months when I didn't buy new clothes, even when mine were worn thin. I remember patching up the same pair of shoes 3 times because I couldn't justify buying another. But Ethan, he always had what he needed. And more than that, he had what I never did. Opportunity. When he got accepted into college, I cried. Not just because I was proud, but because I knew the next chapter would be even harder. College wasn't just expensive. It was overwhelming. Tuition, housing, meal plans, books. It was a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb. But I told him the same thing I had always told him. Don't worry about the money. Focus on your future. He believed me. He smiled, hugged me, and said, "I'll make you proud, Mom." And I believed him too. What he didn't know, what I never told him, was that behind that promise was a woman working harder than she ever had in her life, taking extra shifts, cutting corners, making sacrifices so quietly that even my own son never saw them. So when Ethan stood there and said my sacrifices were imaginary, I didn't just feel hurt. I felt invisible, like every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every silent prayer had been erased. And the worst part, he truly believed it, which meant somewhere along the way, I had lost him. The truth is, losing Ethan didn't happen overnight. It was quiet. So quiet that at first I didn't even realize it was happening. It started when he left for college. I remember that day clearly. The car was packed, his boxes labeled in my handwriting, and the air between us filled with excitement, and something else I didn't want to name. Fear. Not the kind that something bad would happen to him, but the kind that something would change. And I was right. At first, everything felt normal. He called me his first night there, told me about his roommate, the campus, the cafeteria food. He said tasted like cardboard with a personality crisis. I really laughed for the first time in weeks. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then the calls became shorter. Instead of an hour, they were 15 minutes, then 5, then sometimes just a text. "I'm busy, Mom. I'll call you later." I've got a lot going on, and I believed him, because college is busy, because growing up means building your own life, because I had promised myself I would never hold him back. So I gave him space, even when that space felt like a wall slowly being built between us. The first time I heard Lauren's name, it was almost an afterthought. "Oh, and I met someone," he said casually. My heart skipped, not out of fear, but curiosity. "Oh, what's her name?" Lauren, she's different. I smiled at that. Different can be good. Tell me about her. There was a pause. Then he said, she's really smart. She doesn't just accept things. She questions everything. At the time, I thought that sounded admirable. I didn't know that one day she would start questioning me. The first time I met Lauren Hayes, she shook my hand instead of hugging me. That alone told me something. Not wrong, just distant. She looked me in the eye with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Fleming, she said. Please, I replied. Call me Ian. She nodded, but she never did. From the very beginning, there was something about her that made me feel like I was being evaluated. Not as a person, as a variable, like I was part of some equation she hadn't quite solved yet. At dinner, she asked questions. A lot of questions. Where did you work again? How long were you a nurse? Did you ever invest in anything? Did Ethan have a college fund growing up? They were normal questions, but the way she asked them, it felt like she wasn't just curious. She was gathering data. I answered honestly, of course. I worked as a nurse for over 20 years. I picked up extra shifts when I needed to. I didn't really have the luxury of investing. And no, I said gently, there wasn't a formal college fund. I saw something shift in her expression. Just for a second, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Later that night, after they had gone out, I sat alone at the kitchen table replaying the conversation in my head. Something about it didn't sit right with me. But I told myself I was overthinking. Because what kind of mother suspects her son's girlfriend after one dinner? So I let it go. Time passed. Ethan came home less often. When he did, he was different. Not rude, not unkind, just guarded. He no longer talked freely about his classes or his friends. And when I asked about money casually, carefully, he would change the subject. I've got it covered, Mom. Don't worry about it. I'm handling things. Handling things. That phrase started to repeat itself. At first, I felt proud. He was becoming independent, responsible. But then something else crept in. Distance. I remember one weekend when he came home for Thanksgiving. I had spent 2 days preparing everything. Turkey stuffing his favorite sweet potato casserole. The house smelled like comfort, like tradition, like everything I had tried to build for him. But when he walked in, his hug felt brief, like an obligation instead of a connection. Lauren arrived shortly after. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, perfectly distant. During dinner, the conversation turned to finances. Not because I brought it up, because she did. So Ethan, she said, cutting her turkey neatly, have you finalized your payment plan for next semester? I looked up. Ethan nodded. Yeah, it's handled. Lauren tilted her head slightly. All on your own. There was something in her tone, something subtle, something probing. Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he said, yeah. I felt that word land somewhere deep inside me, because I knew it wasn't true. Not completely. But before I could say anything, Lauren spoke again. That's impressive, she said. A lot of people rely heavily on their parents. Her eyes flickered toward me, just for a moment, and then back to Ethan. He didn't notice, but I did. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to embarrass him, because I didn't want to create tension, because I trusted that whatever misunderstanding was forming, it would pass. But it didn't. After that, the pattern became clearer. Every time money came up, Lauren would ask questions. Every time she asked, Ethan would answer in a way that minimized me. Not intentionally, but consistently. And slowly, piece by piece, something began to change. Not just in what he said, but in what he believed. There were moments, small ones at first, when I felt it. A hesitation before thanking me. A shift in tone when I offered help. A subtle resistance when I reminded him of something I had done. Like he was starting to rewrite the narrative of his own life. And I wasn't in it anymore. The hardest part wasn't the distance. It was the confusion, because I didn't know where it was coming from. I didn't know what he had been told, or what he thought he knew. All I knew was that my son, the boy who once called me from a diner just to say he missed me, was slowly becoming someone who looked at me like a stranger. And somewhere along the way, someone had started telling him a different version of our story. One where I wasn't the woman who held everything together, but someone who had done nothing at all. And the worst part, he was beginning to believe it. The moment Ethan finally said it out loud, everything inside me went still. It wasn't just what he said. It was how certain he sounded. That kind of certainty doesn't come from doubt. It comes from belief. Deep, unshakable belief. And that's what frightened me the most. We were standing in my living room, the same one where I had spent years making sure he felt safe, warm, and loved. The same room where he used to sit cross-legged on the floor doing homework while I folded laundry nearby. But now it felt like unfamiliar ground. Like I was the one who didn't belong there anymore. "You never paid my tuition," Ethan said again, slower this time, like he was trying to make sure I understood. "Not in college. Not before that either." My lips parted, but no words came out. Because I didn't know where to begin. Do you argue with someone who believes you don't exist in your own story? Lauren stood beside him, quiet but not passive. She watched me the way someone watches a test subject. Carefully, measuring every reaction. "Ethan," I finally said, my voice softer than I intended. "I don't understand why you think that." He let out a small breath, almost like he had expected me to say that. "Because I checked," he replied. "I went through everything. My tuition statements, payment history, financial records. There's nothing under your name. Nothing." That word echoed in my head. Nothing. As if all those years had left no trace. "That's not possible," I whispered. But even as I said it, a strange feeling crept in. Not doubt in what I had done, but confusion about how it had been done. Lauren stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to insert herself into the moment. "Well," she said calmly, "sometimes people remember things differently than they actually happened." I turned to look at her. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no uncertainty, just quiet confidence, like she already knew the answer, and I was the one struggling to catch up. "I don't remember differently," I said more firmly this time. Ethan shook his head. "Then explain it to me," he said. "Because from what I can see, every major payment came from somewhere else." My chest tightened. "Somewhere else?" I repeated. He nodded. "Yeah. Different accounts, different sources. Some of them weren't even consistent. But none of them were you." My heart started beating faster. Not because I was afraid he was right, but because I didn't understand how he could be so sure. "Who do you think paid for it?" I asked. For a moment, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw something. Not doubt, but discomfort. Like even he wasn't completely certain, but didn't want to admit it. Then he said it. "I think Dad helped more than you ever told me." The room seemed to tilt. "Your father?" I repeated, barely recognizing my own voice. Ethan shrugged slightly. "I mean, it makes more sense, doesn't it?" No, it didn't. Not even a little. David Fleming hadn't just left. He had disappeared. There were no checks, no support, no quiet contributions behind the scenes. I knew that because I had lived every single day of that reality. He didn't pay for anything. I said the words sharper now. Ethan frowned. You don't know that for sure. I do. I insisted. Lauren spoke again gently but deliberately. Ethan, she said, maybe your mom just wasn't aware of everything. Sometimes parents try to protect their kids by not telling them the full truth. I stared at her. There it was again. That subtle shift. That quiet redirection. Not accusing me outright, just repositioning me. From the one who sacrificed to the one who didn't know. I was there. I said, my voice steady but low. Every bill, every payment, every decision. I was there. Ethan crossed his arms. But the records don't show that. The records, always the records. As if numbers could erase reality. As if data could rewrite history. Then the records are wrong, I said. Lauren tilted her head slightly. Or incomplete, she suggested. Ethan looked at her, then back at me, and in that moment I saw it clearly. He trusted her, more than he trusted me. That realization hurt more than anything he had said, because it meant this wasn't just about money. It was about belief, about who he chose to believe. Why would I lie about something like this? I asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked down for a moment, then back up. I don't know, he said, but something doesn't add up. Something doesn't add up. I almost laughed, because for years nothing in my life had added up. Not the hours I worked, not the bills I paid, not the sacrifices I made. But I made it work anyway. And now, somehow, that invisible effort had turned into invisible proof. Lauren took a small step back, giving Ethan space, but still present enough to guide him. I'm not saying you didn't try, she said to me, her tone softening just slightly. But trying and actually doing are two different things. That did it. Something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but firmly. Because I had spent years staying quiet. Years choosing peace over confrontation. Years putting Ethan's comfort above my own truth. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was erasure. I didn't just try. I said, my voice calm but unwavering. I did everything. Ethan shook his head again. Then prove it. The words landed like a challenge. A line drawn between us. And suddenly, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't going to be solved with explanations, or memories, or emotion, because Ethan wasn't listening to my heart anymore. He was listening to evidence, and if that's what he needed, then that's what I would have to find. But as I stood there, looking at my son, my own flesh and blood, asking me to prove that I had been there for him, I felt something deeper than anger. I felt fear. Not fear of being wrong, but fear of what it meant if I couldn't prove the truth. Because if I couldn't, then maybe in his eyes, I really had been nothing at all. And that was something I couldn't accept. Not after everything. Not after all those years. Not after building a life for him out of nothing but determination and love. So I took a breath. And for the first time since this conversation began, I didn't feel lost. I felt focused. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, the truth doesn't disappear. It just gets buried. and I was about to start digging. That night after Ethan and Lauren left the house felt wrong, not empty. It had been empty before plenty of times. When Ethan first went to college, when he stopped coming home as often, when silence slowly replaced laughter. But this was different. This silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Like something had been broken and the pieces were still scattered across the floor. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I just stood there in the dim glow from the kitchen, staring at the space where my son had stood, where he had looked at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. Or, worse, someone he didn't believe. I finally moved slowly and sat down at the table, the same table where I had once sorted bills late into the night while Ethan slept down the hall. Back then, every number mattered, every receipt, every due date, because falling behind wasn't an option, not when someone else's future depended on me. And now, somehow, those same numbers were being used against me. The records don't show that. Ethan's voice echoed in my head. The records. I whispered it out loud as if saying it might make it clearer. The records. If the records didn't show what I knew to be true, then either something was missing or something had been changed. I stood up abruptly, because sitting there wasn't going to solve anything, and for the first time since this started, I realized something important. Emotion wasn't going to fix this. Memory wasn't going to fix this. I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. The kind that doesn't rely on trust. The kind that doesn't leave room for interpretation. The kind that even Ethan couldn't argue with. So I went to my bedroom and opened the closet. At the back, tucked behind old coats and a box of photo albums, was a plastic storage bin. I hadn't touched it in years, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need to. Everything in that box belonged to a time when survival was my only focus. And once we made it past that, I wanted to leave it behind. But now, I needed it again. I pulled the bin out and set it on the bed. For a moment, I just looked at it, because opening it meant going back. Back to the nights I tried to forget. Back to the stress, the fear, the constant pressure of not knowing if I could keep everything together. But I didn't have a choice. I lifted the lid. Inside were folders, old envelopes, stacks of papers held together with clips that had long since lost their shine. I sat down and started going through them. Electric bills, rent receipts, medical statements, pay stubs from the hospital, pay stubs from the diner. I picked one up and stared at it. $18 an hour. That's what I was making on night shifts back then. I did the math in my head without even trying. 12 hours a shift. Multiple shifts a week. And still, it barely covered what we needed. I kept digging. And then I found them. Tuition statements. High school first. Private school. I remembered the decision to send Ethan there. It had terrified me. The cost alone was enough to make anyone hesitate. But I had looked at him, his grades, his drive, his potential, and I knew I couldn't hold him back because of money. So, I signed the papers, and then spent years figuring out how to pay for them. I flipped through the statements. Each one showed the amount due. Each one showed the balance paid. But the payment method, that's where things started to feel off. The payments weren't listed under my personal checking account. Instead, there were references, codes, transfer IDs. I frowned, because I remembered making those payments. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table logging into accounts, moving money around, making sure deadlines were met. So, why didn't it show my name? I moved on to the college records. Those were harder to find. Not because they weren't there, but because they weren't where I expected them to be. Some were printed, some were just confirmation emails, others were missing entirely. And the ones I did have, they told the same confusing story. Payments made, balances cleared, but no clear connection to me. I leaned back, my heart starting to beat faster. This wasn't right. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was a gap, a disconnect between what I knew I had done and what the records showed. And suddenly, something Lauren had said earlier came back to me. Sometimes people remember things differently than they actually happened. I shook my head. No, that wasn't it. I wasn't remembering wrong. But maybe, just maybe, I wasn't remembering how. Because back then, I hadn't handled everything directly. There had been help. Not financial help, administrative help. Someone who had suggested a system. A way to manage payments more efficiently. A way to organize everything so it wouldn't overwhelm me. I closed my eyes, trying to reach back into those memories. Who was it? Someone from the hospital, no. Someone outside. Someone who dealt with finances. And then it hit me. Harold Bennett. The name came to me suddenly like a light turning on in a dark room. He had been a financial advisor, not someone I worked with regularly, just someone I had gone to when things started to get too complicated. When tuition payments, loans, and deadlines became too much to track on my own. He had helped me set up a system, a structured way to make payments, to keep everything organized. At the time, it had felt like a lifeline. I didn't have to think about every transaction. I just had to make sure the money was there, and he would handle the rest. I opened my eyes. That was it. That had to be it. If the payments went through a system, just had to make sure the money was there, and he would handle the rest. I opened my eyes. That was it. That had to be it. If the payments went through a system, through an account or structure managed by someone else, then of course my name wouldn't appear directly on every record. To Ethan, it would look like the money came from somewhere else, not from me. I stood up, my mind racing. For the first time since this started, things were beginning to make sense. Not completely, but enough to see the outline of the truth. And more importantly, enough to know where to look next. Because if Harold Bennett had been involved, then there had to be records. Real records. Not just statements and summaries, but detailed documentation. Proof. The kind Ethan had been asking for. The kind that could finally answer the question that had been hanging over everything. Who paid? I looked down at the scattered papers on my bed. Years of effort, years of sacrifice, reduced to confusion and missing connections, but not gone, not erased, just hidden. And if they were hidden, then I could find them. I took a deep breath. Because this wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was about reclaiming the truth. About making sure that everything I had done, everything I had given was seen. Not for recognition, not for praise, but because my son deserved to know the reality of his own life. And I deserved to be part of it. So I reached for my phone, and for the first time in years, I searched for a name I thought I would never need again. Harold Bennett. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again. Ethan's voice, Lauren's calm certainty, the cold weight of those words. The records don't show that. But now I had something they didn't. A lead. Harold Bennett. By morning, I was already dressed, my coffee untouched on the kitchen counter as I searched online. It took longer than I expected. His name wasn't exactly rare, and the Harold Bennett I remembered wasn't someone who had a big online presence. But eventually, I found something. An old listing. Bennett Financial Consulting closed. My heart sank. Closed. Of course it was. It had been years. But then I noticed something else. A small note at the bottom. Contact information updated. There was a phone number. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was just about to hang up when, hello, there was a phone number. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was just about to hang up when, hello? The voice was older, a little rougher, but something about it felt familiar. Mr. Bennett? I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. Yes, who is this? This is Ian Fleming, I said. You helped me years ago with financial planning for my son's education. There was a pause. Not the kind that signals confusion, the kind that signals memory. Ian Fleming, he repeated slowly. The nurse, right? Single mother? Yes, I said quickly, relief rushing through me. That's me. Well, Ilby, he said softly. That was a long time ago. Yes, I replied. And I'm sorry to call out of nowhere, but I need your help. Something in my tone must have reached him, because his voice changed, more serious. Is everything all right? I hesitated. How do you explain something like this? My son, I said finally, believes I never paid for his education. Silence. Then, what? He says, the financial records don't show any payments from me. I continued, and I don't understand why. There was another pause, longer this time. Then Harold let out a quiet breath. Ah, he said. I think I know what's going on. My grip tightened on the phone. You do? Yes. He said. Do you remember the structure we set up? Yes, I replied quickly. You said it would make everything easier, that I wouldn't have to manage each payment individually. That's right, he said. We created a trust-based payment system. Your funds went into a managed account, and from there, payments were distributed to the school and later the university. My heart started pounding. So the payments, they didn't come directly from me? Not in a way that would show up under your personal name on standard statements, he explained. They were processed through the trust account. I closed my eyes. Of course. That was it. That's why he can't see me? I whispered. Exactly, Harold said. To anyone reviewing basic records, it would look like the money came from the trust itself. Not from you personally. I felt a mix of relief and anger rise inside me. Relief because I wasn't crazy. Because there was an explanation. Anger because that explanation had turned my entire life into something invisible. Can you prove it? I asked. There was no hesitation this time. Yes, Harold said firmly. But it might take a little work. I'll do whatever it takes. I believe you will, he replied. You always did. That simple statement, it hit me harder than I expected, because for a moment, someone remembered. Someone saw me. What do we need? I asked. Well, he began. I don't have your records on hand anymore. When I retired, most client files were transferred or archived. But I pressed. Everything we did was properly documented for tax purposes. He continued, which means there's a paper trail. A very detailed one. Tax records. The word landed differently this time. Not as something distant or bureaucratic, but as something real, something solid. So, if I access my tax filings from those years, I said slowly, you'll find documentation of the contributions you made to the trust, he confirmed, and likely records of the disbursements as well. I sat down, my legs suddenly weak. This was it. This was the proof. Not memories, not explanations. Numbers. Official. Undeniable. But there's something you should understand, Harold added. What is it? Even with those records, your son may not immediately accept it, he said gently. When someone believes something strongly, evidence doesn't always change their mind right away. I swallowed. I know. Then why are you doing this? He asked. The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I hadn't said it out loud yet. Because he deserves the truth, I said finally. And because I deserve to be seen. There was a quiet moment on the other end. Then Harold said, That sounds like the Ian Fleming I remember. I felt something in my chest loosen, just a little. Thank you, I said. I'll help however I can, he replied. If you run into trouble accessing the records, call me back. I will. We hung up. And for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the wall. Everything was starting to make sense now. The missing connections, the invisible payments. The reason Ethan couldn't find me in his own history. It wasn't that I hadn't been there. It was that I had been hidden. By design. By a system that was meant to protect him, but ended up erasing me. I stood up slowly. Because now there was only one thing left to do. Find the records. Not just any records. The right ones. The kind that couldn't be dismissed. The kind that didn't rely on interpretation. The kind that spoke in facts, not feelings. I walked back to my bedroom where the papers were still spread across the bed. For the first time since I opened that box, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt focused. Because now I wasn't just looking for answers. I knew where to find them, and more importantly, I knew they existed. I picked up one of the old tuition statements again, running my fingers over the faded ink. For years, this had been enough for me, knowing what I had done, knowing what I had given. But now I needed more, because love apparently wasn't proof. Sacrifice wasn't proof. Memory wasn't proof. But numbers could be. And if that's what it took for my son to finally see me, then I was going to find every single one of them. No matter how far back I had to go, no matter how much it hurt to dig through it all again. Because this time, I wasn't doing it alone. I had the truth on my side. And for the first time since Ethan spoke those words, I believed I could prove it. The next morning, I walked into the IRS office with a folder clutched tightly in my hands, even though I knew it didn't contain what I actually needed. Not yet. The building itself was exactly what you would expect: gray walls, fluorescent lights, and a silence that didn't feel calm so much as procedural. People sat in rows, holding papers, waiting their turn, like they were standing in line for something far more important than they wanted to admit. I took a number and sat down, and for the first time since this all began, I felt nervous. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I didn't know how much of it I would actually be able to prove. There's a difference between knowing something in your heart and holding it in your hands. And right now, I needed something I could hold. Something Ethan could see. Something that couldn't be dismissed with a simple shake of his head. When my number was called, I stood up and approached the counter. The woman behind the desk looked at me kindly but professionally. "How can I help you today?" I swallowed, steadying my voice. "I need access to my tax records," I said, "from about 15 to 20 years ago." She nodded, already typing. "Do you have your ID?" I handed it over. "And can you tell me specifically what you're looking for?" she asked. I hesitated for just a moment, then I said it. "I need to prove that I paid for my son's education." She paused, just for a second, and in that second, I saw something flicker across her face. Not judgment, not curiosity, recognition, like she had heard stories like mine before. "All right," she said gently. "Let's see what we can find." It took time, more time than I expected. Forms had to be filled out. Requests had to be processed. Some records were archived, which meant they weren't immediately accessible. But I didn't rush her, because for years I had rushed everything, worked faster, moved quicker, pushed harder. And look where that had gotten me. Now I needed patience. Finally, she handed me a stack of documents. "These are your filings from the years you requested," she said. "If what you're looking for was reported properly, it should be in here." I nodded. "Thank you." I found a quiet corner and sat down. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first file. It felt strange. Going back into those years, not through memory, but through numbers. Official numbers, the kind that don't lie, the kind that don't forget. I flipped through the first few pages. Income, deductions, nothing unusual. But then, there it was, a line item. Trust contributions. My breath caught. I leaned closer, reading carefully. Year after year, there it was again. Different amounts, but consistent, regular, documented. I turned the page, and then the next, each one showing the same pattern. Money going into something labeled as a managed trust. The same trust Harold had mentioned. The same system that had hidden me. And yet, here I was, right there. Not in the way Ethan expected. Not as a direct payment to a school, but as the source, the origin, the reason those payments existed at all. I felt tears sting my eyes, because this was proof. Not emotional, not subjective, real. I kept going, deeper into the records. And then I found something else. Disbursement summaries. Attached documents that detailed where the trust funds had gone. Tuition payments, housing, books, living expenses. Each one matching the timeline of Ethan's life. Each one tied back not directly to me, but to the contributions I had made. It was all there. Every sacrifice, every late night, every dollar I had fought to earn. It hadn't disappeared. It had just been translated, converted into something that looked distant, impersonal, untraceable. But now I could see it, clear as day. I sat there for a long time just staring at the pages, because part of me still couldn't believe it. Not that the records existed, but that I had needed them. That after everything, after all those years, I had to prove that I had been there. I wiped my eyes quickly, not wanting to draw attention. And then I started organizing the documents. Carefully, methodically, because this wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about presenting it in a way Ethan couldn't ignore, in a way that connected the dots he couldn't see. I created a timeline, year by year, Contribution by timeline, year by year. Contribution by contribution, payment by payment. Linking everything together. So that when he looked at it, he wouldn't just see numbers. He would see the story behind them. My story, our story. And maybe, just maybe, contribution, payment by payment. Linking everything together. So that when he looked at it, he wouldn't just see numbers. He would see the story behind them. My story, our story. And maybe, just maybe, he would finally understand. But as I gathered everything, something else settled into my mind. A quiet realization. This wasn't just about misunderstanding anymore. Because the information had always been there. Not obvious, not simple, but available. Which meant someone had looked at it and chosen a version of the truth. A version where I didn't exist, and I couldn't ignore that. Because Ethan didn't come to that conclusion alone. He had help. Lauren. Her voice echoed in my memory. Sometimes people remember things differently than they actually happened. No, that wasn't what happened. This wasn't memory. This was interpretation. Selective interpretation. And suddenly, I saw it more clearly than ever. She hadn't lied outright. She hadn't needed to. All she had done was guide Ethan to look at the evidence in a way that erased me, and he followed, because he trusted her, because she sounded certain, because the records on the surface supported her version. I closed the folder slowly, my hands steady now, because something inside me had shifted. At first, this had been about confusion, then pain, then determination. But now it was clarity. I knew the truth. I had the proof, and I understood how it had been twisted, which meant there was only one thing left to do. Face them, not with emotion, not with arguments, but with facts. The kind that don't leave room for doubt. I stood up, holding the folder close. It felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the paper, but because of what it carried. Years of my life. Reduced to documents, but finally visible. As I walked out of the building, the sunlight hit my face. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel invisible. I felt ready. Because the next time Ethan looked at me and asked for proof, I wouldn't have to explain. I wouldn't have to defend. I would simply show him. And this time, he wouldn't be able to look away. I didn't call Ethan right away. That might surprise you. After everything I had just found, after finally holding proof in my hands, you would think the first thing I'd do is pick up the phone and demand he listen. But I didn't. Because this wasn't just about showing him documents. It was about breaking through something deeper, and I knew if I did it wrong, he wouldn't hear me. So instead, I waited. 2 days. Not because I needed time to prepare the evidence, but because I needed to prepare myself. Because if I walked into that conversation still carrying hurt, anger, desperation, he would feel it, and he would shut down. Just like he had already started to. So I spent those 2 days doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I sat with my memories, not to prove anything, not to justify anything, but to remember clearly, without fear, without needing validation. I looked through old photo albums. Ethan at 10 years old, missing his front tooth, grinning at the camera like the world belonged to him. Ethan at 16 holding his acceptance letter to that private high school I nearly broke myself paying for. Ethan at 18 standing in front of his college dorm full of excitement and trust. He trusted me back then. That's what hurt the most. Not that he questioned me now, but that somewhere along the way, that trust had been replaced by doubt, and I needed to understand why. On the third day, I called him. He didn't answer, but he texted back. "What's up?" 3 words. Short, neutral, distant. I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Can we talk in person?" There was a pause, long enough for me to feel that familiar tightening in my chest. Then his response came. "About what?" I took a breath. "The records." Another pause, longer this time. Then finally, "Okay, just 1 word," but it was enough. We agreed to meet that evening. Not at my house. Not at his apartment. A neutral place. A small cafe halfway between us. I got there early. Not because I was eager, but because I needed a moment to ground myself. The folder sat on the table in front of me. Neat. Organized. Everything laid out the way I had prepared it. But as I sat there watching people come and go, I realized something. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a turning point. Not just in how Ethan saw me, but in who we were to each other. Because after today, things wouldn't go back to how they were. They couldn't. Either he would see me again, or he wouldn't. And that thought sat heavy in my chest. When Ethan walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he had changed physically, but because of the way he carried himself. Confident, guarded, measured. Lauren wasn't with him. That surprised me. But it also told me something. This mattered. At least enough for him to come alone. He sat down across from me. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was so much between us, and yet it felt like we didn't know where to begin. Finally, he nodded toward the folder. "So, this is it." I followed his gaze. "Yes." He leaned back slightly. "You found something?" I met his eyes. "I found everything." There was a flicker of something in his expression. Curiosity. Maybe even a hint of unease. "Okay," he said. "Show me." I opened the folder slowly. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just carefully. Like I was handling something fragile. Because in a way I was. "This," I said, sliding the first document toward him, "is my tax record from your first year of high school." He glanced down, then back up at me. "Okay. Look at the line here." I continued, pointing gently. "Trust contributions." He frowned slightly, leaning closer. His eyes scanned the page. I watched him as he read. Not just what he saw, but how he reacted. Confusion, focus, calculation. "It's a contribution," he said. "To what exactly?" "A managed trust," I replied. "The one that paid your tuition." He looked up sharply. "That doesn't prove you paid the school." "I know," I said calmly. "Keep going." I handed him the next document, and then the next. Year after year. Contribution after contribution, and then the disbursement records. His posture changed. I could see it happening. Slowly, subtly, but undeniably. The certainty he had carried into this conversation was starting to crack. "These payments," he said quietly, flipping through the pages. "They match my tuition timeline." "Yes, but they're coming from the trust. Yes. He looked at me again, more carefully this time. Which you funded? He said slowly. Yes. The words sat between us, heavy, real. And for the first time since this all began, he didn't argue. He didn't push back. He just looked at the documents again, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had believed. I didn't know about this, he said finally. I know. Why didn't you tell me? The question wasn't accusing. It was confused. And maybe just a little hurt. Because it wasn't important for you to know at the time, I said gently. My job wasn't to show you how things worked. It was to make sure they worked. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. That's not how it looked, he admitted. When I checked the records, it really seemed like you weren't involved. I understand that, I said. But what you saw wasn't the full picture. Silence fell between us again. But this time, it wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was shifting. Like something was moving beneath the surface. I thought he started, then stopped. What? I asked softly. He hesitated, then said it. I thought maybe you had exaggerated things over the years. That hurt, even now. But I didn't react, because this wasn't about defending myself anymore. It was about understanding. I didn't exaggerate, I said quietly. But I also didn't explain everything, and maybe that left space for misunderstanding. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I guess it did. I watched him carefully, because this was the moment where things could turn, where truth could either land or be rejected. But then he said something I didn't expect. Lauren was the one who pushed me to look into it. There it was, not surprising, but hearing it out loud changed something. What did she tell you? I asked. He hesitated again. She just asked questions, he said, pointed out inconsistencies, made it seem like something didn't add up. I nodded. Because that's exactly what she had done. Not lied, not directly, just guided. And you trusted that, I said. He looked down. Yeah, I didn't say anything else, because I didn't need to. The truth was already sitting in front of him, in black and white, and for the first time. He was actually seeing it, not through someone else's interpretation, not through doubt, but for what it really was. And as he sat there flipping through those pages again, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not certainty, not confidence, but something much more important, reflection. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. Ethan didn't leave right away. After he finished going through the documents, he just sat there, quiet, not defensive, not argumentative, just still. And that stillness told me something. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove a point. He was trying to understand. I didn't know, he said again, softer this time. I nodded. I believe you. He looked up at me, surprised. You do? Yes, I said. Because if you had known, you wouldn't have said what you said. That seemed to land somewhere inside him. Not as relief, but as realization. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. I really thought I had figured it out, he admitted. I went through everything. The payment portals, my statements, even old emails, and none of it pointed to you. I know, I said, because it wasn't designed to. He frowned. What do you mean? The system I used? I explained gently. It wasn't meant to show where the money came from. It was meant to make sure the money got where it needed to go. He sat back, processing that. So you basically made yourself invisible. The system I used, I explained gently, it wasn't meant to show where the money came from. It was meant to make sure the money got where it needed to go. He sat back processing that. So you basically made yourself invisible. The words hit harder than he probably intended. But I didn't flinch. Not intentionally, I said. At the time, I thought I was making things easier. For both of us. He ran a hand through his hair again, a habit he had when he was overwhelmed. I guess it worked, he said quietly. Too well. We both sat with that for a moment. Because he was right. It had worked. Ethan never had to worry about tuition deadlines, never had to question whether rent was paid, never had to carry the weight of financial stress the way I had. He had been free to focus on his life, his future, exactly what I had wanted. But in doing that, I had removed myself from the visible equation. And now, that absence had been interpreted as lack. I should have told you, I said finally. Ethan looked up. Maybe, he said, but I also should have asked. That surprised me, not because it wasn't true, but because he was willing to say it. I didn't ask, he continued. I just assumed. His voice tightened slightly, and then Lauren started asking questions. And everything she pointed out, it made sense, at least at the time. I nodded slowly. What exactly did she say? He hesitated, not because he didn't remember, but because now he was starting to hear it differently. She didn't say you lied, he said, not directly. But I prompted gently. But she kept pointing out gaps he admitted. Like, if your mom paid for everything, why isn't her name anywhere? Or, wouldn't there be direct transfers? I listened carefully, because this mattered. Not just what was said, but how it was said. And how did that make you feel, I asked. He let out a slow breath. Confused at first, he said, then curious, and then convinced. I nodded. That's how it works. He looked at me. What do you mean doubt doesn't start as belief? Confused, at first, he said, then curious, and then convinced. I nodded. That's how it works. He looked at me. What do you mean doubt doesn't start as belief? I said quietly. It starts as a question, and if you don't have the full answer, that question grows. He looked down at the papers again, and I didn't have the full answer. No, I said. You didn't. Silence settled between us again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was reflective, like both of us were seeing the same thing, from different sides. After a moment, Ethan spoke again. There's something else, he said. I waited. Lauren didn't just question things, he continued. She interpreted them. I raised an eyebrow slightly. How? He shifted in his seat. She would say things like, maybe your mom wanted you to think she did more than she actually did. Or, sometimes people exaggerate their struggles to feel appreciated. There it was. Not a lie, but a narrative, a carefully planted idea. And once that idea took root, everything else started to support it. And you believe that, I said softly. He didn't answer right away. Then finally, yeah, he said. I did. I studied his face, not judging, not accusing, just understanding. Because belief is powerful, especially when it's built slowly, piece by piece, until it feels like truth. I'm sorry, he added suddenly. The words came out quickly, almost instinctively, but they weren't rushed. They were real. I felt something shift inside me. Not fully, not completely, but enough to feel it. I know, I said, and I meant it, because this wasn't just about being right. It was about what came after. Ethan looked at the folder again, then back at me. So, what happens now? It was such a simple question, but it carried so much weight. Because now wasn't just about the truth. It was about us. I don't know, I admitted. He nodded. Yeah, me neither. We both let out a small, almost awkward breath. Because for all the clarity we had just gained, there was still something unresolved, not in the facts, but in the relationship. And then Ethan said something that shifted everything again. I need to talk to Lauren. I felt a subtle tension rise in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, because this was the next step, the one that would reveal something deeper. What are you going to say? I asked. He shook his head slightly. I don't know yet, he said, but I need to understand why she pushed this so hard. That was the right question. Not just what she said, but why. Because people don't invest that much effort into shaping someone else's belief without a reason. Be careful, I said quietly. He looked at me. Why? Because not everyone who sounds certain is telling the truth, I replied. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. I think I'm starting to understand that. We sat there a little longer, not talking, not arguing, just being in the same space, and for the first time in a long time. It didn't feel like distance. It felt like the beginning of something else. Not resolution, not yet, but possibility. As Ethan finally stood up to leave, he paused. Mom. The word felt different this time, softer, more grounded. Yes. He hesitated, then said, Thank you for not giving up on this. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man he had become, at the confusion he was working through, at the truth he was finally starting to see. I never gave up on you. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man he had become, at the confusion he was working through, at the truth he was finally starting to see. I never gave up on you, I said gently. His eyes softened, and for a brief moment I saw my son again. Not the version shaped by doubt, not the one influenced by someone else's voice, but the one I had raised, the one who had once trusted me without question. And as he walked away, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet, because the truth had only just begun to surface. And somewhere in that truth was another layer, one that hadn't been fully revealed. Not about me, but about Lauren, and whatever role she had really been playing in all of this. I didn't hear from Ethan for 2 days after that conversation. Not a call, not a text, nothing. And I didn't reach out either. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew this part. This part had to happen without me. Whatever he was going to discover next, he needed to see it on his own. Because the truth I had shown him, that was only one half of the story. The other half was about Lauren, and whatever role she had really played in all of this. The silence gave me too much time to think. Not about the proof anymore. That part was done. I had the records, the tax filings, the timeline, everything aligned. That wasn't the question anymore. The question now was, why had Lauren pushed so hard to make Ethan believe something else? Because misunderstanding is one thing. But persistence, that's intention. And intention always has a reason. On the third evening, my phone finally rang. Ethan. I didn't answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I needed one steady breath before I picked up. Hello? His voice was different, lower, tighter. Mom, can we talk? Something in the way he said it made my heart shift. Yes, I said. Are you okay? There was a pause. Then, no. That one word told me everything. "Do you want to come over?" I asked gently. "Yeah," he said. "I think I need to." He arrived about 30 minutes later, and the moment I opened the door, I knew something had changed. Not in a small way, in a breaking kind of way. His eyes were red, not from anger, from something deeper, something heavier. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," he replied, but his voice cracked slightly. That hadn't happened in a long time. He stepped inside, and for a moment, he just stood there, like he didn't know what to do with himself. "Sit down," I said gently. He nodded and walked into the living room. The same place where everything had shattered just days before. But now, it felt different. Not calmer, but more honest. Ethan sat on the couch, leaning forward, hands clasped together. I sat across from him, waiting, because this wasn't my moment to speak. This was his. "I talked to Lauren," he said finally. I nodded slowly. "And?" He let out a shaky breath. "At first, she stuck to the same story," he said. "That the records didn't show you. That everything pointed somewhere else." I didn't interrupt. "But then I showed her what you gave me," he continued. "The tax records, the trust contributions, the disbursements." His voice tightened, and something changed. There it was, the shift. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked up at me. "She stopped arguing." That alone said a lot. "Just like that?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. No pushback, no explanation, just silence. I felt a chill run through me, because people who believe they're right don't go quiet. "What did she say?" I asked. He hesitated. Then, "She said maybe she had been wrong." Maybe. Such a small word, but it carried so much avoidance. "And you believe that?" I asked carefully. He shook his head. "No." That answer came faster than anything else he had said. "Why not?" "Because this mattered. Not just what he saw, but what he understood. Because it didn't feel like a mistake," he said. "It felt like something she had been building." I felt something settle inside me, because that was the truth. Not a misunderstanding, a construction. "What happened next?" I asked. Ethan leaned back, his jaw tightening. "I asked her why she kept pushing it," he said. "Why she kept bringing it up over and over again." He paused. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It wasn't just hurt now. It was anger. She said she was just trying to protect me. I let out a slow breath. Of course she did. That's how it always sounds. Protection. Concern. Care. But underneath it, there's something else. And then I asked. Ethan's hands clenched slightly. I asked her from what he said. Silence filled the room for a moment, and then he said it. She didn't have a real answer. That was the crack. The moment where everything started to fall apart. "Did she say anything else?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "She said she didn't trust you. That didn't surprise me. Not anymore." "But when I asked her why," he continued, "she couldn't explain that either." He let out a bitter breath. "It was like she had decided something about you a long time ago, and everything else just had to fit that decision." "Exactly. That's how it works. Not evidence shaping belief. Belief shaping evidence." And then Ethan said, his voice dropping, she said something I can't stop thinking about. I leaned forward slightly. What? He looked at me, and for the first time since he walked in, there was no confusion in his eyes, only clarity. She said, "People like your mom always make themselves look like the victim." The words hung in the air. Sharp, ugly, final. I felt them hit me, but they didn't break me. Not anymore. Because now I understood. This was never about the records. This was never about the money. This was about perception, about control, about shaping how Ethan saw me, and for a long time, it had worked. "What did you say?" I asked, softly. Ethan's expression hardened. "I told her she didn't know you." His voice was steady now, grounded, and she said maybe I didn't either. That line, that one line, it explained everything, because that's what she had been doing all along, separating him from me, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, rewriting his understanding of who I was. "So, what happened?" I asked. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I left." Just 2 words, but they carried weight. "You left?" I repeated. He nodded. "I didn't yell," he said. "I didn't argue. I just saw it. Saw it. That moment when everything clicks, when the illusion breaks, when the story you believed doesn't hold anymore." "I couldn't stay," he added quietly. "Not after that." Silence filled the room again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was real. And then Ethan looked at me, not with doubt, not with distance, but with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Truth. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said. And this time, it wasn't just words. It was understanding. "I'm so sorry, Mom." I had heard apologies before in my life. From coworkers, from friends, from people who didn't mean them, and from people who did. But this one landed differently, because it wasn't rushed. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't trying to fix something quickly and move on. It came from understanding, real understanding, and that's what made it heavy. Ethan sat there looking at me like he was seeing something he hadn't fully seen before. Not just the proof, not just the facts. Me. "I should have trusted you," he said quietly. I let the words sit for a moment before responding. "Trust isn't something you're supposed to force," I said gently. "It's something that gets built, and sometimes it gets shaken." His eyes dropped. "I didn't just let it get shaken," he said. "I replaced it." That level of honesty, it wasn't easy. I could see it in the way his hands tightened slightly, the way his shoulders carried weight. But he didn't pull away from it. He stayed with it. And that mattered. "You believed what made sense to you at the time," I said. "But it wasn't the truth," he replied quickly. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." Silence settled between us again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Because forgiveness doesn't happen in one moment. It unfolds. Slowly, carefully. And right now, we were standing at the beginning of that process. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I keep replaying it," he admitted. Everything she said, every question, every doubt. I nodded. "That's what happens when something breaks open," I said. "You start going back trying to see where it started." He gave a small, almost humorless laugh. "Yeah," he said, "and now I can see it." I didn't interrupt, because he needed to say this out loud. "At first, it felt like she was helping me understand things better," he continued. like she was just being logical. He shook his head slightly, but then it turned into something else. "What do you mean?" I asked softly. She didn't just question things he said. She guided where the answers went. That phrasing, it was accurate, precise, and I didn't notice he added, "Not at first." "That's how it works," I said. "If it was obvious, it wouldn't work at all." He nodded slowly. "I trusted her," he said. "I know. And because I trusted her, I started doubting you." That was the core of it. Not just influence, but transfer of trust from one person to another. "I hate that," he said, quietly. I watched him carefully, because this part mattered more than the apology. "I hate that I let someone else define how I see you," he continued. There was frustration in his voice now, not directed at me, at himself. "I should have come to you," he said. "I should have asked you directly, instead of building this whole thing in my head." I took a slow breath. "You're here now," I said. He looked up. "That doesn't erase what I said." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. That truth needed to be acknowledged, because pretending it didn't matter would only bury it deeper." "I hurt you," he said. "Yes," I replied honestly. The word hung in the air. Not sharp, not accusing, just real. And he didn't look away from it. "I can't take that back," he said. "No," I said again. "But you can understand it." He nodded slowly. "And you can decide what you do differently moving forward." He sat back, absorbing that. Because that's what this was about now. Not the past, but the future. "How do we fix this?" he asked. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. "We don't fix it all at once," I said. "We rebuild it." "Rebuild," he repeated. "Yes," I said. "Trust, communication, all of it." He looked down at his hands again. "That sounds like it's going to take time." "It will," I said. He nodded. "I'm okay with that." And something in the way he said it felt solid, not rushed, not desperate, just committed. We sat there for a moment, letting that settle. And then Ethan asked something I hadn't expected. "Are you mad at me?" I paused, because that question deserved an honest answer. "Not in the way you think," I said. He looked up, waiting. "I was hurt," I continued, "deeply, because it felt like you erased everything I had done for you." His expression tightened. "But I'm not mad at who you are," I added gently, "because I can see that you're trying to understand." He exhaled slowly. "That doesn't make it okay," he said. "No," I agreed, "but it makes it human." That word seemed to land differently. Human, flawed, imperfect, capable of mistakes, but also capable of growth. "I don't want this to be who I am," he said. "It isn't," I replied. He looked at me, searching for certainty. "You made a mistake," I continued. "That's not the same as being the mistake." His eyes softened slightly. And for the first time since he walked in, he seemed to breathe a little easier. He started, then hesitated. "What?" I asked. "I don't know how to trust my judgment right now," he admitted. That was the real aftermath. Not just broken trust between us, but shaken trust within himself. "That's normal," I said. "It doesn't feel normal," he replied. "It doesn't feel good," I corrected gently. "Doesn't feel good," I corrected gently. But it's part of learning. He sat with that. So what do I do? He asked. I thought for a moment before answering. You slow down, I said. You ask more questions. And you don't let one perspective become the only perspective. It's part of learning. He sat with that. So what do I do? He asked. I thought for a moment before answering. You slow down, I said. You ask more questions, and you don't let one perspective become the only perspective. He nodded slowly, especially when it comes to people you care about, I added. He looked at me. I should have done that with you. Yes, I said, but you can do it now. Silence returned again, but it wasn't heavy. It wasn't painful. It was rebuilding. And then Ethan said something that surprised me. I don't think I can be with Lauren anymore. I didn't react immediately, because that decision had to be his. Not influenced, not guided. His. Why, I asked calmly. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before answering. Because I don't know what's real with her anymore, he said. If she could do this, if she could shape something this big, what else has she shaped? That question. It doesn't have an easy answer, and he knew that. I need space, he added, to figure that out. I nodded. That sounds reasonable. He looked at me almost like he was expecting resistance. You're not going to tell me what to do, he asked. I shook my head. No, I said. That's not my role. What is your role then? He asked quietly. I smiled gently. To be your mother, I said. Not your judge. That broke something open in him again. Not in a painful way, in a healing way. Because for the first time in this entire situation, there was no conflict, no defense, no distance, just connection. And as we sat there, in that quiet, honest space, I realized something. The proof hadn't just changed his mind. It had given us something we didn't even know we had lost, a way back to each other. Not the same as before, but maybe stronger, because this time it wasn't built on assumption. It was built on truth. After that night, something changed between Ethan and me, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. There were no sudden hugs, no perfectly timed emotional breakthroughs that erased everything overnight. Instead, it was quieter than that, more fragile, more real. He started coming by more often. At first, it was small things, a quick visit after work, a short conversation over coffee, moments that on the surface didn't seem like much, but I could feel it. He was trying, and that mattered more than anything. The first time he came over again, he stood at the door for a second longer than usual, like he was remembering something, or maybe realizing something. This place hasn't changed, he said. I smiled faintly. It wasn't supposed to. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Not casually, carefully, as if he was seeing things he had overlooked before. His gaze stopped on a framed photo sitting on the shelf. It was one of my favorites. Ethan at 12, holding a science fair ribbon, looking proud and slightly embarrassed at the same time. You kept this one, he said. Of course I did, I replied. He walked closer, picking it up. I remember this, he said quietly. You stayed up all night helping me finish that project. I nodded. You were convinced it wasn't good enough. He let out a small breath. Yeah, I was. He set the photo back down, but his hand lingered for a second, and I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about correcting the past, it was about reconnecting to it. Because doubt doesn't just affect what you believe in the present, it reshapes how you remember the past. And now, he was starting to see those memories clearly again. "I've been thinking a lot," he said as he moved to sit down. "About what?" I asked. "Everything," he replied. "Not just what happened with Lauren, but how I got there." I sat across from him listening. "Go on." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment before speaking again. I realized something he said. It wasn't just her influence. That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" He exhaled slowly. "I think part of me was ready to believe it." I didn't interrupt, because that kind of honesty needed space. I didn't want to think that he continued. But the more I looked at it, the more it made sense. How I asked gently. He hesitated. "Then I think I resented you," he admitted. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. "Resented me?" I repeated. He nodded. "Not in a conscious way," he said quickly, "but it was there." I let that settle, because this was deeper than misunderstanding. This was something that had been building long before Lauren came into the picture. "Why?" I asked softly. He looked down at his hands. "I think I felt like I had to live up to everything you sacrificed," he said. "And I didn't know how to handle that. That was something I hadn't expected." "I never wanted you to feel that way," I said. "I know," he replied. "But that doesn't mean I didn't." He looked up at me. "You gave me everything," he continued, "and instead of just being grateful, part of me felt pressure." I sat there absorbing that. Because love, even when it's given freely, can still feel heavy to the person receiving it. I think when Lauren started questioning things, he said it gave me a way to release that pressure. My chest tightened slightly, by believing I hadn't done as much I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "because if that was true, then I didn't owe as much." There it was, the hidden layer, not just influence, but relief. A reason to believe something easier, something lighter, even if it wasn't true. "I didn't realize I was doing that," he added quickly. "Not at the time." "I believe you," I said. "Because I did." Human beings don't just believe what's true. They believe what's easier to carry. And sometimes, those two things are very different. "I hate that I needed that," he said. "Don't," I replied gently. He looked at me confused. "Why not?" "Because it means you're human," I said. "Not perfect." He let out a slow breath. "I don't feel very good about it." "You're not supposed to," I said. "Growth doesn't feel good at first." He gave a small, almost reluctant nod. "Yeah, I'm starting to understand that." We sat in silence for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. And then he said something that shifted things again. "I ended things with Lauren." I looked at him carefully, not surprised, but still aware of what that meant. "How are you feeling about that?" I asked. He leaned back, exhaling. "Mixed," he admitted. "Part of me feels relieved, and part of me feels stupid." "Why stupid?" I asked. "Because I didn't see it sooner," he said. "Because I let it go as far as it did." I nodded. "That's not stupidity," I said. "That's hindsight." He looked at me. "It feels like more than that." "I know," I said. "But you didn't have the clarity then that you have now." He sat with that. "I keep thinking about what she said," he added, "about you making yourself look like the victim." I felt the weight of those words again, but they didn't cut the same way anymore. "And what do you think now?" I asked. He met my eyes. I think she needed that to be true, he said. That answer? It told me everything, because he understood now. Not just what she said, but why she said it. She needed a version of you that justified her doubts. He continued. Otherwise, she would have had to question herself. Exactly. That's how it works. Beliefs protect themselves, even when they're wrong. I'm sorry you had to go through that, I said, quietly. He shook his head. I'm sorry I brought it into this house, he replied. That mattered, because it meant he understood the impact, not just on himself, but on me, on us. You're here now, I said again, and this time it felt different, more grounded, more real. He nodded. I want to do better, he said. You will, I replied. How do you know? He asked. I smiled gently. Because you're asking the question. He let out a small breath. And for the first time in a long time, I saw something settle in him. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to move forward. And as we sat there in that quiet space, I realized something. The truth hadn't just cleared my name. It had uncovered everything underneath. The pressure, the resentment, the influence. All the things we hadn't talked about before. And maybe that was the real purpose of all of this. Not just to prove what I had done, but to understand what we had become. And finally, start rebuilding from there. The weeks that followed didn't feel like a resolution. They felt like adjustment. Slow, uneven, sometimes uncomfortable adjustment. Ethan and I were talking more, yes. But rebuilding something broken isn't the same as continuing something that was never damaged. There were pauses now. Moments where we both hesitated before speaking. Not because we didn't have anything to say, but because we were learning how to say it differently. More honestly, more carefully, and that kind of honesty takes practice. One afternoon, Ethan came by earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, going through a stack of old mail when I heard the door open. Hey, he called out. Hey, I replied, stepping into the living room. He looked different, not upset, not confused, but thoughtful, like something had been sitting in his mind for a while. I found something he said. That immediately caught my attention. What kind of something, I asked. He walked in holding his phone loosely in his hand. I was going through some old emails, he said, from back when I was in college. I nodded slowly. Okay, and I realized something I didn't notice before. He continued. He sat down, unlocking his phone. There were emails from the trust manager, he said. Updates, confirmations, things like that. I felt a quiet recognition settle in my chest. Yes, I said, there should have been. He looked up at me. I never paid attention to who was copied on those emails, he said. My heart tightened slightly. Who, I asked. He turned the phone toward me, and there it was. My email address, copied on every single one, every confirmation, every disbursement, every record. I stared at it for a moment. Not because I didn't remember, but because seeing it now through his eyes made everything clearer. You were there the whole time, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. I just never looked closely enough. His voice carried a weight that wasn't just regret. It was realization, because this wasn't about missing information. It was about overlooked information. I didn't hide. His voice carried a weight that wasn't just regret. It was realization, because this wasn't about missing information. It was about overlooked information. I didn't hide, I said gently, but I also didn't make myself obvious. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I can see that now. He looked at the phone again, scrolling slightly. There are dozens of these, he said, and every time you're there? I sat down across from him. Because I never stopped being there, I said. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to be, but they carried truth. Simple, steady truth. He swallowed slightly, his jaw tightening. I feel like I ignored you in more ways than one, he admitted. I shook my head gently. You didn't ignore me, I said. You just didn't know where to look. He let out a quiet breath. But I should have, he said. Maybe, I replied. But you didn't, and now you do. He sat there for a moment processing that, and then he said something that caught me off guard. I want to show you something else. I raised an eyebrow slightly. What is it? He hesitated. Then I went back to Lauren's messages. He said. The air in the room shifted slightly, not tense, but alert. Why? I asked carefully, because I needed to understand how it happened. He said, not just what she said, but how she said it. That made sense, because patterns don't always reveal themselves in single moments. They reveal themselves over time. He opened a thread on his phone and scrolled. Listen to this, he said, reading aloud. It's strange how some parents take credit for things that systems actually handle. He paused, then looked at me. At the time that sounded logical, he said. Now it sounds different. I nodded slowly. Because now you know the system didn't exist without someone behind it. Exactly, he said. He kept scrolling. Here's another one, he continued. I'm not saying your mom didn't help, just that maybe it wasn't as much as you think. He shook his head slightly. She never outright said anything extreme, he said. She just chipped away. Piece by piece. That's how doubt works. That's what made it believable, he added. Yes, I said quietly, because it didn't feel like an attack. Outright said anything extreme, he said. She just chipped away. Piece by piece. That's how doubt works. That's what made it believable, he added. Yes, I said quietly, because it didn't feel like an attack. He nodded. It felt like concern, he said. And concern is easy to trust, I replied. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling again. I don't think I understood how much influence something like that can have, he said. Most people don't, I said. He looked at me. Have you ever experienced something like that? He asked. I hesitated, because the answer was yes. More than once. In different ways, I said carefully. Not exactly like this, but I've seen how people can shape perception. He nodded slowly. And it's hard to see when you're inside it, he said. Yes, I agreed. Because it feels normal while it's happening. He sat quietly for a moment. Then I don't want that to happen again, he said. The way he said it was firm, grounded, like a decision. It won't, I said. He looked at me. How do you know? Because you've seen it now, I replied. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. He considered that, then nodded. I guess that's true. We sat there for a while, talking through different moments. Not just the big one, but the small ones. the comments, the questions, the subtle shifts. And as we talked, something became clearer. This hadn't been one moment. It had been a process, a slow build. And now, we were undoing it the same way, slowly, carefully, with awareness. At one point, Ethan looked at me and said something that stayed with me. "I think I needed to go through this," he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" "Because I've never questioned anything like this before," he said. "I've always just trusted what felt right. And now I asked. Now I know that feels right doesn't always mean is right," he replied. "That because I've never questioned anything like this before," he said. "I've always just trusted what felt right. And now I asked. Now I know that feels right doesn't always mean is right," he replied. That was growth. Real growth. Not comfortable, not easy, but necessary. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. He looked surprised. "Why?" "Because you didn't stop when things got uncomfortable," I said. "You kept looking." He let out a small breath. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But you did," I said, "and that's what mattered." We fell into a comfortable silence after that. Not empty, not strained, just present. And as I watched him sit there, more grounded than I had seen him in weeks, I realized something. This wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about building something stronger in its place. Not blind trust, not unquestioned belief, but something deeper, something more aware. And maybe that kind of trust would last longer. There was a quiet kind of healing that settled into our lives after that. Not loud, not obvious, but steady. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but you feel it in the small things. Ethan started calling me just to check in. Not because something was wrong, but because he wanted to. At first, it caught me off guard. I had gotten so used to distance to silence to only hearing from him when something needed to be discussed. Now there were moments where he'd call and say, "Hey, I was just thinking about you." Simple words, but they carried something deeper. Presence. And presence is one of the clearest forms of love. One Sunday afternoon, he invited me to lunch. Not at my house, not at his, but at a small diner we used to go to years ago. Back when things were simpler, when conversations weren't layered with tension, when trust was just there. I almost didn't recognize the place when I walked in, not because it had changed, but because it had been so long. Ethan was already there, sitting in a booth near the window. He stood up when he saw me, a small gesture, but one he hadn't made in a while. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, smiling faintly. We sat down, and for a moment we just looked at the menu. Not because we needed to, but because it gave us a second to settle. "This place still smells the same," he said. I laughed softly. "Some things don't change." He nodded. "And some things do," he added quietly. I met his eyes. Yes, they do. There was no tension in that statement, just acknowledgement, and that alone felt like progress. We ordered our food, and for a while we talked about ordinary things, work, daily routines, small moments, nothing heavy, nothing complicated. And yet, it felt meaningful, because this was something we hadn't had in a long time. Normal, comfortable, connected. At one point, Ethan leaned back and looked at me. "I've been thinking about something he said." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "That seems to be happening a lot lately." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess it is." "What about I as Ked?" He hesitated for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about something," he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. That seems to be happening a lot lately. He smiled faintly. Yeah, I guess it is. What about? I asked. He hesitated for a moment. Then, I've been thinking about how I define people, he said. That caught my attention. Go on. I realized I used to define people based on what they showed me directly. He continued. What I could see. What I could verify. I nodded slowly. That makes sense. But now I see that's not always enough, he said. Because not everything important is visible. I felt something settle in my chest. Because that was the heart of everything, like what I asked gently. He looked at me. Like what you did for me, he said. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be, because now they were understood. I thought if I couldn't see it clearly, it didn't exist, he continued. But that's not true. No, I said softly. It's not. He leaned forward slightly. And I think I judged you based on what I could see instead of trusting what I knew. That distinction. It mattered, because seeing and knowing aren't always the same thing. And what do you know now? I asked. He didn't hesitate. I know you were always there, he said. The simplicity of that statement. It carried more weight than anything else, because it wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about records. It was about presence, consistency, love. I nodded, my throat tightening slightly. Thank you, I said quietly. He smiled faintly. You shouldn't have to thank me for seeing something that was always true, he replied. Maybe not, but I still felt it. Because being seen after being doubted is its own kind of healing. Our food arrived, and for a while, we ate in comfortable silence. Not the kind that feels empty. The kind that feels settled. At one point, Ethan set his fork down and looked at me again. There's one more thing I want to say, he said. I nodded. Go ahead. He took a breath. I don't want to just move past this, he said. I want to remember it. That surprised me. Why? Because I don't want to repeat it, he said. I don't want to ever let doubt replace trust like that again. I studied his face, and I could see it. This wasn't just a reaction. It was a decision. That's a good thing to hold on to, I said. He nodded. I also want to say something else, he added. I waited. I appreciate you more than I ever said before, he said. The words came slowly, carefully, like he wanted to make sure they were right. I think I always felt it, he continued, but I didn't express it. And then, when things got complicated, it got buried. I felt my chest tighten again, but this time, it wasn't from hurt. It was from something softer. You don't have to say it perfectly, I said gently. You just have to say it honestly. He smiled. I'm trying. I can see that, I replied. We finished lunch slowly, not rushing, not lingering unnecessarily, just present. And as we stood up to leave, Ethan did something that caught me off guard. He hugged me, not briefly, not awkwardly, but fully, like he meant it. And in that moment, I felt something settle. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know that we were no longer standing on broken ground. We were building something new, something more aware, something more honest. As we walked out of the diner, the sunlight felt warmer than it had in a long time. Not because the world had changed, but because something between us had. And maybe that was enough. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything felt completely repaired, perfectly aligned, or magically restored to what it used to be. But maybe that was the point, because what Ethan and I were building now wasn't meant to be what it used to be. It was something different, something more aware, something tested, and because of that, something stronger. A few months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. Ethan found a small apartment closer to his work. Not far from me, close enough that we could see each other regularly, but far enough that he could still have his own space, his independence. One evening, he invited me over for dinner. "I'm cooking," he said over the phone. I couldn't help but smile. "You're cooking?" I teased. "Hey," he replied, half laughing. "I've learned a few things. I'll believe it when I see it." "You will," he said. "Just don't come with low expectations." "I wouldn't dream of it," I said warmly. When I arrived, the apartment smelled surprisingly good. Garlic herbs, something roasted. I stepped inside, looking around. It was simple, clean, but lived in. There were small details that caught my attention. A framed photo of us from years ago. A bookshelf with things he had chosen himself. A space that felt but lived in. There were small details that caught my attention. A framed photo of us from years ago. A bookshelf with things he had chosen himself. A space that felt intentional. "You made this place your own," I said. He looked up from the kitchen, smiling slightly. "Yeah," he said. I wanted to start fresh. That word held meaning now. Not as an escape, but as a continuation with awareness. Dinner was simple but good. Better than I expected. "I'm impressed," I admitted. "I told you," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. We sat at the small dining table, eating and talking. And for the first time, in a long time, there was no shadow between us. No unspoken tension. No lingering doubt. Just connection. At one point, Ethan leaned back and looked at me. "I've been thinking about something again," he said. I laughed softly. "That seems to be your thing now." "Yeah, I guess it is. What is it this time?" I asked. He paused. "Then I've been thinking about what you did," he said. "Not just financially, but everything." I didn't interrupt. "I used to think of it as sacrifice," he continued. "Like you gave something up for me." I nodded slowly. "That's one way to look at it. But now I see it differently," he said. "How?" I asked. He met my eyes. "I think you chose it," he said. "Not because you had to, but because you wanted to." That mattered, because there's a difference between obligation and choice. "I did," I said softly. "And that changes how I see it," he continued. "Because it wasn't something I was supposed to repay. It was something you gave." My chest tightened slightly. Not from pain, from something deeper. Understanding. "I think that's what confused me before," he said. "I felt like I owed something I didn't know how to repay. And instead of dealing with that, I tried to minimize it." I nodded slowly. "That makes sense. But now I don't feel that pressure anymore," he said. "I just feel grateful." That word, it landed gently, not heavy, not overwhelming, just right. "That's all I ever wanted," I said, quietly. He smiled. "I know." We sat in that moment for a while, and then he said something that I didn't expect, but somehow I had been waiting for. "I trust you," he said. Simple, clear, final, not based on documents, not based on proof, but based on understanding. I looked at him, letting the words settle. "Thank you," I said softly. He nodded. "And I trust myself more now, too," he added. That part might have mattered even more, because this wasn't just about us anymore. It was about who he had become through all of this. "I'm glad," I said. We finished dinner talking about plans, small goals, things ahead, normal life. But it didn't feel ordinary. It felt earned. As I got ready to leave, Ethan walked me to the door. "Mom," he said. "Yes." He hesitated for a moment. "Then I'm really proud of you." The words caught me off guard. "Proud of me?" I repeated. "Yeah," he said, "for how you handled everything, for not giving up, for standing in the truth even when I didn't see it." I felt my throat tighten again. Because those words, they closed something, not just the conflict, but the wound. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded. "And I'm glad you didn't let me walk away with the wrong story," he added. I smiled gently. I couldn't let that happen. He opened the door and I stepped outside. The evening air was calm, still, and for the first time in a long time, so was my heart. As I walked to my car, I realized something. The truth hadn't just proven what I had done. It had revealed everything underneath. The love, the pressure, the misunderstanding, the growth, all of it. And in the end, it hadn't just restored my name. It had restored my relationship with my son. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but honestly. And sometimes, that's even more powerful. After story life lesson and reflection. There are moments in life when being misunderstood cuts deeper than any loss. Because it doesn't just question what you did, it questions who you are. In this story, the pain didn't come from money. It didn't come from sacrifice. It came from being unseen, from having years of quiet love reduced to doubt. But here's the truth. Many of us learn too late. Not all love is loud. Not all sacrifice is visible. And not all truth is easy to prove. Sometimes the people who love us the most don't stand in the spotlight. They work behind the scenes. They carry burdens silently. They choose us again and again without asking for recognition. And sometimes that silence becomes their greatest vulnerability. Because when doubt enters, there are no visible signs to defend them. That's why trust matters. Not blind trust, but thoughtful trust. The kind that asks questions instead of making assumptions. The kind that seeks understanding before judgment. And if you've ever been in a place where someone doubted your love, or where you doubted someone who truly cared about you, know this. It's never too late to look deeper, to ask again, to listen differently, and maybe to rebuild. Because relationships don't break from one moment, and they don't heal from one apology. They heal through truth, through patience, through the willingness to see each other clearly, even after everything has been shaken. If this story touched you in any way, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been misunderstood like this? Or have you ever realized you were wrong about someone you love? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in stories that reveal truth healing and second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe. Wherever you are in the world right now, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because behind every story, there's a real person listening and maybe finding a piece of their own story inside it.